Gumby. Everybody knows Gumby. He's the little green cartoon character from the TV show that ran from the 1950s until... I don't really know, but it started in the 1950s. And I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of my childhood watching this. More specifically, the second cartoon on it called Gumby Concerto. Now, the version that I watched on this disc was the original from the 1950s, but what I didn't know at the time was that they actually completely resounded the same cartoon in the 1980s, because for some reason, they felt that the original soundtrack on it was just no good, so they completely removed it and completely overdubbed everything. Sometime in the 1980s, I'm not really sure. And I don't think I'm alone when I say that the 80s version is just a little bit off. Anyway, let's start by looking at the title screen from the original version. Now, wasn't that just delightful all around? Now, of course, it doesn't make a lot of sense that organ sounds would be coming out of a cello and a horn. And apparently that's exactly what the people in the 80s were thinking, because in the newer version, they, well, take a look. Now, obviously that version makes a lot more sense, but it's not really as Well, okay. So after that, the cartoon actually begins with Gumby and his two little music note friends, I suppose, riding a roller skate to Music Land. And, of course, the 50s version has different music than the 80s version, and, well, the thing about the 80s version is that it's mostly synthesizers, so it comes off a lot stranger than the 50s version, which is just delightful, like, dancing 50s music, while the 80s version just kind of sounds like Ocarina of Time mixed with Undertale. If you can imagine that kind of music, that's what it sounds like. In fact, here's a comparison. Oh jeez, it's getting dark. I hate winter! One small thing I should mention before we move on is that the small amount of voice acting that there is in this cartoon, they did completely change it, and it's not too bad most of the time, but I really noticed a difference with this guy here.
That's fine for you two children, but what about you in front? That's more like it.
Well, that's fine for you two children, but what about you in front? That's more like it.
Anyway, after all that, Gumby goes and plays a piano that keeps flying away or something, but that's largely the same on both versions, so I don't really have a need to include it. What I do have a need to include, though, is what happens next, where Gumby goes crazy with all the pianos and the instruments and goes around, because they added so many unnecessary sound effects in that part in the 80s that it just becomes downright annoying. Bagpipes? So now you can really see what I mean when I say that the 80s version really is not as good as the 50s version. Now what happens next is probably the strangest part in the whole cartoon, where Gumby goes on a piano and well, just look at this. Now, if you ask me, I think Gumby ate the wrong cookies that day. So that was fun. But in the 80s version, they changed the music and added those weird sound effects again, and there's a long stretch where there's just no sound effects at all, and it's just this mellow music, and it's really boring. So after all that, Gumby goes around on the piano. There's a big face that pops up and goes down again for some reason. That's never explained. He jumps up and down. Those parts are really mostly the same. And then there's the end screen, which even the end screen in the 80s version is just really not as good. So anyway, that was Gumby Concerto, the original version, and the strange 80s redubbing, or overdubbing, whichever term you use. I don't know why they did it. It was just something that was happening in the 80s, where they took all the old Gumby cartoons and changed them completely, which I'm not sure entirely what they were aiming to accomplish, because it doesn't add anything to the story at all. It just makes it a lot weirder, and I really don't like it as much as the 50s version. So anyway, that'll do it for now. So, this has been Stanley427, and I will see you all next time with Little Gumby. Do you know, actually, in the pilot episode, Gumby sang his own theme song that was never heard again. Very strange.